Luke Anderson's life seems perfect: a successful businessman, a loving husband, and a devoted father. However, he is about to confront the harshest truth. His world is merely an illusion. When Luke accidentally discovers his wife's secret affair with his best friend, everything he knew begins to unravel. Each new day becomes a struggle against his own demons as he attempts to untangle the web of lies that has ensnared him. In his quest for truth and revenge, Luke risks losing not only his family, but also himself. How far is he willing to go for justice, and can he reclaim what has been lost? Hey, dear friend, while you're listening to this exciting story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and put your gorgeous like. As a child, I never foresaw where life would lead me. My early years were filled with optimism for the future, and meeting Stella only seemed to confirm my hopes. With her, I believed I'd found a lifelong partner, and we began building a shared vision of the future, eventually marrying and planning for a family. But over time, our promises to each other seemed to lose their strength, as subtle cracks in our relationship widened into divides I hadn't anticipated. Looking back now, I can't identify the exact moment when everything began to slip away. Maybe it all began after Eleanor was born, my daughter, or at least, that's what I thought then. The ease of our early days gave way to a growing silence, with tensions and unspoken resentments filling the space between us. For years I tried to fix what was broken, convincing myself we could restore the love we once had. But I was only chasing illusions. One day I finally spoke up, my voice cutting through the room with a resolve I hadn't felt before. "I'm done," I said, exhausted. "Good. Don't bother coming back," Stella replied coldly, her words dripping with disdain. Normally I would have fired back with something harsh, maybe a simple, "Go to hell." But for some reason I couldn't bring myself to say it this time. 16 years of marriage had seen countless arguments, but this fight felt different. In the past, I'd always returned, no matter how hurtful the words exchanged between us had been. But now, it felt like a final break. Soon enough, she'd feel my absence. Lately, her words had grown sharper, almost venomous, as though something deeply bitter had surfaced in her. At first, the change in her baffled me, like a sudden storm rolling in without warning. Eventually, I began avoiding home, staying out late to escape her barbed comments. Often, by the time I got back, she and Eleanor had already eaten, and any leftovers were gone. I felt like a ghost in my own home. I suppose I should introduce myself properly. My name is Luke Anderson. Officially, I'm David Luke Anderson, named after my father, David, though they've called me Luke since day one to avoid confusion. I'm not a junior, as my father's middle name is John, but sometimes I wish I had been. Maybe having a nickname like Junior or DJ would have suited me. Instead, I'm simply Luke. And yes, I'm Polish, or more accurately, an American with Polish heritage. I've heard my fair share of jokes. People in this small town of about 10,000 come up with new ones every year. I'm one of the few people of Polish descent here, so I'm often the target of their humor. Technically, though, I'm only half Polish. My mother's side is a mix of German, French, Irish, and English. But with a last name like Anderson, I've always just been the Pole to everyone here. As for Stella, my wife, though soon to be ex-wife, she wasn't who I thought she was. I realized that only 4 weeks ago. As our hostility grew, I found myself avoiding home more and more, putting distance between myself and her increasingly cruel remarks. After skipping dinner several nights in a row, I chose to go out for a meal one Monday evening. I had barely settled in at a local diner when I overheard a conversation in the booth next to mine. My attention piqued when I heard a man mention the word Pole. I tuned in and caught one of them ask, "So, how long have you been seeing Paula's wife?" The other responded, "Since they got married. I even spent their wedding night with her, and he never knew." I didn't recognize the first voice, but I knew the second one instantly. It was my best friend, Gabriel Smith. Shocked, I listened as they continued, but my mind was numb until Gabriel said, "Yeah, we meet up at least twice a month. Luke's too busy with his cars to notice. Total idiot." The waitress came by to take my order just then. "Sorry, I have to go," I mumbled, rising quickly to leave without being seen by Gabriel. The realization hit me like a punch. Stella, my wife, had been involved with my best friend, Gabriel, who had been my best man and even worked as my mechanic. Well, at least until now. Technically, I guess he isn't exactly my mechanic anymore. Gabriel is the mechanic I count on to keep all my vehicles in top shape. In case you're wondering, I run a used car dealership. Yes, I sell used cars, and despite the jokes and cliches, business is good. I've heard all the stereotypes, but my clients know they're getting reliable cars at fair prices, and they trust I'll be there if anything goes wrong. Over the years, I've built a reputation for standing by my cars, and Gabriel has been a huge part of that. He's an exceptional mechanic, and I keep him busy and well paid. Once, I even offered him a permanent position, but he turned it down with a laugh, saying, "I could never work for a guy with a flagpole in his front yard." He laughed it off, but I couldn't help but feel he meant it. Instead, I brought him on as a contractor. Technically, he's independent, but in reality, my business is his primary source of work. That setup might be his downfall. As I left the restaurant, I kept wondering if he'd been serious or if it was just a joke. Hiring a private investigator crossed my mind, but with Gabriel saying they only met a couple of times a month, it seemed unnecessary. Instead, I decided to check Stella's phone and email myself. When I got home, Stella was her usual irritated self, which didn't bother me much. I wasn't in the mood for conversation until I had some answers. After she fell asleep, I checked her email but found nothing unusual. Her phone was locked, but it didn't take long to guess the password. It was our daughter's birth date. I looked through her messages, but there was nothing blatantly suspicious. A few texts could be taken the wrong way, but none were from Gabriel. He was saved in her contacts, but that made sense. He was my best friend after all. Maybe he'd been joking after all. Still, something didn't sit right. Stella had been acting odd lately, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. If it wasn't Gabriel, maybe it was someone else. As I lay there turning it over in my mind, sleep finally claimed me sometime after 2:43 a.m. The next morning at the dealership, Gabriel showed up with his usual grin. "Hey, Luke, what do you even know about Poland? Bet you couldn't even point it out on a map." I laughed and shot back. "You always have something to say about Poles, but I bet they could find the U.S., maybe even our state, on a map. Now get to work." Gabriel looked a bit taken aback, like he hadn't expected me to snap back. Gabriel wasn't exactly the academic type. Handsome, street smart, and a wizard with engines, but not one for books. Maybe that's why he'd hung around with me back in high school. I'd helped him scrape by enough to graduate. Now, I was beginning to question both my choice of friends and, in a low murmur to myself, my choice of a wife. I went back to my office, realizing I'd need solid proof if I was going to get to the bottom of this. Confronting them without evidence would just end in denial. With that thought, I reached out to a private investigator in Santa Fe and explained my suspicions. After hearing me out, the PI said, "If they're only meeting a couple times a month, round-the-clock surveillance would be costly. A phone tracker could pinpoint her location anytime you want. You could also put cameras in the house, but even the best ones are noticeable, and if she's sharp, she might catch on. I'd start with a tracker, hope to catch them somewhere like a motel." I thanked him for his advice. "Send me the details on a tracking app and I'll pay for your time." "No need," he replied. "You can find all that online." I insisted, saying I'd send a check anyway, and invited him to drop by Anderson's lot if he ever came through Silver City. "I don't usually get out that way," he said, "but I'll keep it in mind. In this business, I've learned that making people feel valued is half the work. Treat people like they matter and they remember it. That's always been my approach with my customers. And, I realized, with everyone around me, building trust requires subtlety and patience." That night, once the house was silent, I quietly installed a tracking app on Stella's phone, linking it to my own. It ran inconspicuously in the background, hidden from view. For the first time in days, I felt a bit of calm settle over me as I drifted to sleep. The next day at work, I found myself opening the app again and again. Stella had a part-time job at the university bookstore, working roughly 15 to 20 hours a week. She referred to it as her fun money and mostly spent it on salon visits. Later, I glanced at the app. She'd gone from the grocery store to home. Gabriel, her coworker, was occupied all day, so the day passed without anything unusual. That evening, I decided to make an effort to be more pleasant with Stella and our daughter. "How about we all go out for dinner at Reveal?" I offered, keeping my tone light. Stella seemed surprisingly receptive, but Eleanor, our 13-year-old, looked less thrilled. "I don't know, Dad," she murmured, shrugging. "Come on, Eleanor. It'll be fun," I urged, and she finally agreed. We piled into the car and headed to the restaurant. The dinner went smoothly enough, though I found myself bringing up Gabriel at one point. "I ran into Gabriel at the shop earlier," I said, watching Stella's reaction closely. Her expression changed. She quickly looked away and shifted the topic as soon as she realized I was watching her. My suspicions reignited. Could Gabriel's claims have some truth? The thought nagged at me that night. I chose not to check her phone. So far, I hadn't noticed anything odd in her messages or calls. Maybe she was deleting things immediately, or maybe there was nothing there to find. As we lay in bed, I turned to her and said, "Thanks for coming out with us. It meant a lot." "Thank you, Luke," she replied, her voice soft. "It was a nice surprise." Then, with a slight flirtatious note, she added, "Maybe you'll get lucky tonight." Her sudden warmth surprised me. It had been months since she'd shown interest. After her evening routine, she joined me in bed, curling up next to me. I felt a conflict brewing. If she was seeing someone else, did I even want this closeness? But I had no proof, so I wasn't going to push her away. I wouldn't initiate anything, but I'd let her make the first move. In the end, we were intimate, though the experience felt flat and mechanical. No sense in dwelling on it. Lying awake afterward, I replayed the evening in my head. Over the following week, I occasionally checked her phone, but nothing seemed amiss. By Saturday night, Stella had already fallen asleep when I decided to take one last look at her phone. No new messages from Gabriel, no odd calls, nothing that raised suspicion. Part of me was ready to believe that Gabriel might have been bluffing, showing off. He'd done that in the past, even back in our school days. But something inside me refused to relax completely. At 2 a.m., still wide awake, I gave up on sleep. I went downstairs, poured myself a Jack and Coke, and sat there, her phone in one hand, my drink in the other. As I thought back, a realization struck me. Her phone password was Eleanor's birth date. Eleanor had been born exactly 9 months after our wedding. A honeymoon baby, or so I'd always believed. But what if Gabriel had really been with Stella around our wedding? The possibility made my pulse race. Could Eleanor not be my child? Heart pounding, I made my way to the bathroom, took a cotton swab, and carefully slipped into Eleanor's room. She lay sound asleep, breathing softly. Gently, comma. I swabbed the inside of her cheek and placed the sample in a plastic bag, then swabbed my own cheek for a comparison. If Eleanor is biologically mine, at least I'll have one less thing to worry about, I thought. But if she isn't? I stopped myself, unwilling to imagine the rest. Sunday blurred by in a haze. Each of us attended to our own tasks, and I kept my interactions with Stella and Eleanor minimal, quietly absorbed in my own thoughts. I kept a tight grip on my emotions, refusing to let any hint of my turmoil show until I had the results in hand. The events of last night weighed heavily on my mind. The memory of collecting those DNA samples clung to me, unsettling my focus. Stella must have sensed my unease, as she eventually asked, "Luke, is something up?" Quickly, I crafted a response. "Just thinking about buying a bunch of cars at the next auction," I replied, sounding casual. "It'll stretch our finances a bit until I can resell some," I added, hoping my explanation was convincing enough. She gave me a look of mild concern. "Just don't go overboard," she said softly. It always struck me as strange when she said "we" about the business, considering the company was in my name alone. I'd purposely kept our relationship out of the company's paperwork, wary of complicating things more than necessary. "I'm thinking about paying off the credit cards and canceling all but one," I added, forming a plan to protect myself financially. "That would improve our credit," she agreed, unaware of the real reason behind my strategy. Deciding to pay down debt and untangle our finances had come to me suddenly, a precaution in case my fears turned out to be true. On Monday morning, I took the DNA samples to the university, where I sought help from someone in the science department. After a quick discussion, they referred me to the department head, who assured me they could run the test. "We have a strong program in cellular and molecular biology," he told me with confidence. "We're happy to help." I handed him the samples along with a few business cards. "I'll give whoever works on this a 10% discount on their next car," I joked, maintaining my business facade. He chuckled. "I've been thinking about upgrading my Camry. I might swing by your lot soon." Forcing a smile, I replied, "Let me know when you're ready." Leaving the university, the gravity of what might come weighed on me, making it hard to breathe. If my suspicions were confirmed, my marriage could be over. When I returned home, I tried to keep my face neutral, saying to Stella, "I'm thinking about expanding our car inventory." It was an easy cover, a convenient excuse to hide the tension brewing inside me. Later at work, I called Paul, my accountant, into my office. Together, we went over the plan to pay off the mortgage and buy more cars, meticulously analyzing the numbers. But my mind kept drifting back to the DNA results. What if Eleanor wasn't my daughter? The next 2 days stretched on painfully, each moment thick with anticipation. Then, on Wednesday evening, I finally received the call. The department head's voice was steady. "I have the results," he said. "I'll meet you at my office," I managed, keeping my voice even. When he arrived, his expression told me everything before he even spoke. Handing me an envelope, he said gently, "The 2 samples are not a match." I nodded, though I had anticipated this. Still, hearing it was like a punch to the gut. Sensing my distress, he offered a diversion. "So, any thoughts on which car to upgrade to?" Trying to keep things professional, I replied, "I need a sports car for a client, maybe a Mazda Miata. I'll check the auction tomorrow." He nodded understandingly. Once he left, I couldn't remain in the office. "I'm leaving early," I told my assistant. "Call if anything urgent happens." I drove aimlessly around the city, my mind reeling. Everything had shifted, my marriage, my family, my entire sense of self. I realized I had to contact my lawyer. Gabriel and Stella would face consequences. They'd betrayed me in the most unforgivable way. I pulled into a quiet restaurant to gather my thoughts before making any drastic moves. As I toyed with my food, one agonizing question kept ringing in my mind. Had I wasted the last 15 years? No real family, no biological daughter? Where did I go from here? This revelation was impossible to ignore. For so long I had suspected, but now that my suspicions were confirmed, there was no turning back. One thing was clear: Gabriel would answer for this. He might have been my best friend, but with betrayal like this, who needs enemies? And Stella, she wasn't blameless. Whether she knew Eleanor wasn't mine or not, she'd hidden a betrayal from me, one that began with my closest friend on the day we said, "I do." Every reason pointed to what I'd overheard being true. She'd been seeing him at least twice a month. A storm of anger brewed inside me, and I knew I needed some distance, a space to let my fury settle before I did something rash. I considered calling Stella, just to tell her I wouldn't be home tonight, but I couldn't bring myself to speak to her face. With my temper simmering, staying away was the only safe option. I didn't trust myself to act rationally, so I dialed her number. "Hello, Luke," she greeted me. "Hey, I'll be staying in Albuquerque tonight to get ready for tomorrow's auction. It starts early at 8, I said, keeping my tone steady. "All right, fine," she replied shortly. Driving out to Albuquerque just for an auction wasn't my usual move, so I imagined she'd think it odd. Maybe she'd see it as a chance to slip out for a while. If she decided to go somewhere, She'd have to come up with a reason for Eleanor's absence when my parents asked, which wouldn't be easy. I intended to track her phone tonight, just to see if she'd venture anywhere. As I made my way to Albuquerque, I pushed my focus toward the auction. My objective was to bring back at least 20 cars, with a Mazda Miata on that list. Arrangements were already set for transport back to my dealership, but I was still left with one challenge: inspections. Gabriel wouldn't be getting any more of my business once he finished his current repairs. He'd think he'd won a gold mine once he heard about the cars I planned to bring in, but I wouldn't be giving him that satisfaction. I'd hold back until I found a new mechanic. My plan was to ask a local dealer at the auction to recommend someone reliable to handle the inspections before sending them back to my small town. I rolled into Albuquerque around 9 and checked into a Best Western. Even as a business owner, I couldn't justify spending company money on a fancy hotel. The room was modest, but comfortable enough, which was all I needed. I'm a practical man with straightforward needs. Once I was settled, I checked Stella's phone tracker. Her phone was still at home, or so it seemed. Sleep didn't come easily that night. My thoughts kept circling back to the betrayal. How could she excuse herself, meeting him not only on our wedding day but regularly, every month for all these years? My mind churned, dissecting every part of our marriage. Sure, we'd had our struggles, but I thought we'd loved each other. Now it felt like I'd been blind from the start. Those early years had their challenges. Having a child hadn't been in the immediate plan. We'd agreed to wait 3 or 4 years before starting a family, planning on 3 kids eventually. Then Eleanor arrived, and everything changed. The fact that my closest friend was the one who'd turned our plans upside down made the last 14 years feel empty. There had been good memories, but now even those seemed tainted. If Stella hadn't been with Gabriel, maybe she'd have had a child with me. Perhaps she wouldn't have struggled so much during her pregnancy, or found raising a difficult child such a miserable experience, which had soured her on the idea of having more. Gabriel had stolen my life when he seduced my wife on our wedding day. Now he saw her twice a month, probably laughing at my ignorance. He would pay for this. As I lay in bed, these thoughts gnawed at me, and anger flared up once more. I knew if I didn't calm myself, sleep would remain out of reach. I turned on the TV, landing on a light-hearted comedy. After a few minutes of laughter, my anger began to recede, and by 11 I finally felt ready to sleep. The auction turned out well. I secured excellent deals on high-quality cars and made some solid connections with Albuquerque dealers. There were no Miatas up for auction, but I found 2 dealers, each with one in stock, a red and a black. I told them I'd finalize once my client confirmed their preferred color. "Of course," they replied. "Just let us know what else you're bringing in, and we'll arrange something." I began to consider attending this auction more regularly. Meeting other business owners gave me fresh ideas for growth and helped keep my mind off my troubles. Later that day, I had a consultation with a lawyer. The outlook was grim. If I pursued divorce, I'd lose half my assets and be saddled with both alimony and child support for a child that wasn't even my own. That's when I decided divorce was not the answer. Instead, I'd leave her with Gabriel's child, a fitting end to the life he'd stolen from me. I made the decision to pay off the mortgage, ensuring she could remain in the house for as long as she wished. Since the loan was solely in my name, she'd have no authority to sell the property. By covering the ongoing costs for taxes and utilities even after I moved out, I could avoid any potential claims of abandonment, keeping my assets secure. However, I still needed to handle matters regarding my business. While it was structured as a corporation for legal protection, further action was necessary to shield it fully. I realized that consulting my business lawyer was essential. By the time I arrived home that evening, the long day had left me exhausted. "I'm wiped out," I said to Stella as I headed toward our bedroom. "I'm going to take a shower and get some sleep." "Would you like something to eat?" she asked as I walked away. "No thanks. I had a late lunch," I responded, grateful for her thoughtfulness. The warmth of the shower felt like a temporary release, as if it could wash away the stress that had been hanging over me. I knew I wasn't free of my problems yet, but taking steps to confront them gave me a small sense of relief. The moment my head hit the pillow, I was asleep. The week had been overwhelming, but with a plan forming, my mind was finally at ease. I woke up early, well before Stella or Eleanor, and headed to the office with a clear sense of purpose. There was a lot to get done, so I threw myself into my work. By the time my team arrived, I was already immersed in spreadsheets, reports, and sales forecasts. I gave Paul a rundown on the recent acquisition of 23 vehicles, explaining that we'd closed the deal with a dealership in Albuquerque just last week. I also pulled Anna aside, asking her to stop assigning tasks to Gabriel but to keep it discreet. She looked slightly confused but nodded. "You're the boss," she said. "Thanks, Anna. I appreciate your flexibility," I replied with a smile. At precisely 9 a.m., I contacted my business lawyer to review my options. "Your corporation status offers some protection," he told me, "but she could still push for a forced sale and try to claim half its value. Have you considered selling it preemptively?" "I hadn't thought of that," I admitted, feeling unsettled. "Selling could keep it out of her reach," he suggested. I hesitated, feeling a pang. This business means the world to me. It's not something I can just let go. "I understand. Let me take a deeper look at your case and see what can be done. I'll have an update for you by the end of the week," he promised. The conversation left me with a heavy heart. This business wasn't just a job. It was the culmination of years of hard work, unlike my strained relationship with Eleanor, I thought bitterly. My anger flared, but I pushed it aside. A professional knows when to set personal feelings aside. Top of my agenda was reaching out to Doug, a department chair interested in buying 2 Miatas. "Doug, it's Kirk Kaminsky. I've got details on 2 Miatas, one red and one black. Still interested?" "Maybe. Depends on the price," he replied. His associate chimed in. "Is there a specific color you're leaning toward? I can bring one by so you can see it in person, and we can discuss pricing," I offered. "Even if we don't reach an agreement, I'm confident I can sell it elsewhere. Any preference?" "Each color has its perks," I continued. "Red is bold but fades over time, while black is sleek but gets hot in our climate. Will you be parking it in a garage?" "Yes, I'll keep it out of the sun," Doug confirmed. "Then red might be the better option unless you prefer the look of black," I suggested. "Red sounds great. When could I take a look?" he asked. "Monday or Tuesday would work," his associate suggested. "Just give me a call when it's ready," Doug replied. "Will do." I ended the call and immediately reached out to the dealer to secure the red Miata for the trade. Gabriel had been eyeing a BMW that had lingered on the lot for 3 months, waiting for the right buyer. In a bigger city, it likely would have sold already, but here it sat. When Gabriel arrived at the office, I saw a few cars still needed repairs. As a contractor, he had the flexibility to set his own hours, as long as he finished the tasks I assigned. For now, this setup worked for me. One day, he overheard a salesman talking about a shipment of 23 cars arriving soon. Gabriel popped into my office. "Hey, Luke, when are those auction cars coming in? I want to get things organized," he asked. "The auction house is arranging delivery," I replied calmly. "They'll probably be here late next week or the week after." Satisfied, he nodded and said he'd let Anna know to put him on the schedule. Then, he walked out. I chuckled to myself. He didn't know what was about to unfold. Over the weekend, I kept my distance from Stella, focusing on yard work and other chores. I'd stopped using the tracker app on my phone to check her location. It was irrelevant now. Any affection I'd once felt had been replaced by pure resentment. Learning I'd been raising another man's child had crossed a line. When Monday rolled around, I was back at the lot, arranging a swap with a dealer in Albuquerque. Drop off the BMW, pick up a Miata. "Sounds great," he said. "Let's have lunch when you're here." The weather was perfect for a drive, so I let Anna know I'd be gone for the day. "Keep an eye on things," I said. "Got it, boss," she replied with her usual enthusiasm. She was such a valuable employee, I made a mental note to increase her pay. The drive was peaceful, and lunch with the dealer was enjoyable. He was friendly, and by the end, I felt like I'd made a new connection. The drive back in the Miata was just as pleasant, with the top down and wind streaming past. I even considered calling another dealer to get a black Miata. Life felt too short not to indulge a little, and I realized a two-seater was probably all I'd need moving forward. When I pulled into the driveway with the bright red Miata, I noticed Stella looking out the window. She and Carrie came outside. "Why did you get this car?" Stella asked, her tone dripping with disapproval. "We need a car with a back seat for Eleanor." I shrugged and replied, "I picked it up for a client in Albuquerque. Thought maybe you'd want to go for a ride." She declined, her tone dismissive. "No, I don't care for small cars." I turned to Eleanor. "Come on, give it a try." She shook her head, saying, "No, Dad. People already tease me because of my last name. I don't need to be seen with a Polish used car dealer." The comment stung. I looked at Stella, expecting some sort of reprimand, but she stood there, unbothered. Perfect. Now both of them seemed to have lost any respect for me. "Fine, I'll take another drive," I muttered, backing the car out. I spent hours driving around Silver City, anger simmering the whole time. By the time I got home, it was close to 9:30. I headed straight upstairs, took a shower, and slipped into bed without saying a word. Eventually, Stella came in. The light from the hallway hit my face and I squinted, shutting my eyes. "What's wrong with you?" she scoffed. "Upset because we didn't like your little sports car? Are you going to sulk like a child all night? You're not just Polish, you're acting like a kid." Her voice was sharper than ever, dripping with disdain. I couldn't help but suspect that Gabriel had something to do with her sudden hostility. She grew closer to him by the day, letting his contempt for my background seep into her perspective. Now she was passing that same disdain on to her daughter, Eleanor. I reminded myself, Eleanor was her child, not mine, and while I was financially responsible for her, I didn't need to see her as my own. Frustration bubbled over and I blurted, "Seems like you and your daughter want nothing to do with me, so why don't you both just leave me alone?" Her attitude only fueled my irritation, solidifying my decision to ensure she'd regret her behavior. From that moment on, the Anderson household turned cold and silent. The next day, Doug dropped by to inspect the Miata. He couldn't believe the price, which was $3,000 below Kelly Blue Book. As we wrapped up the paperwork, he mentioned, "My best friend handles vehicle acquisitions for the university. We replace about 16 cars every 2 years. It's not a huge order, but maybe you'd like to talk with him." Seizing the opportunity, I replied, "Absolutely. I'm always open to making connections." "Perfect. I'll have Jim reach out by week's end," Doug responded, looking pleased. Building these relationships, genuinely valuing people and their recommendations, had always been the backbone of my business success. By Wednesday, I received a call from my lawyer. "Luke, I think I've figured out a way forward with your situation. Can you stop by this afternoon to go over it?" he asked. Eager to move on from my home life, I agreed. That afternoon he laid out a plan, and I could see it might actually work. It would take a couple of weeks to set in motion, but if it all came together, it would be worth the wait. In the meantime, I began gradually moving my belongings and work tools to a nearby apartment, preparing for a fresh start. Meanwhile, Gabriel kept calling, eager to get started on the 24 cars he was waiting to work on. Each time he asked, I found a way to stall him. That weekend, while Stella and Eleanor were out, I packed up my closet and drawers as part of my quiet exit. Since Stella usually handled the laundry during the week, she wouldn't notice my clothes disappearing little by little. By Monday night, I was ready to make my move. "I'm leaving," I informed her plainly. She responded with her usual scorn, mocking my Polish heritage and my career in used cars. In the past, her insults would have driven me to leave temporarily, but this time I knew it was permanent. Early Tuesday morning, after one final argument, I went straight to the car lot. As my employees started to arrive, I gathered them in the conference room for what they assumed would be our usual weekly meeting. "Good morning," I began. "As you know, the cars we acquired a few weeks back have arrived, have been inspected, and are ready for sale. Going forward, Gabriel won't be handling any more of our work. If he asks, just let him know we're moving in a new direction. I softened my tone, looking around at the faces I'd worked with for so long. You all feel like family to me, which makes what I have to say even harder. I paused, taking a steadying breath. I've sold the business. Surprised expressions filled the room, but I continued. Nothing is going to change for any of you. Anna, you'll be taking over some of my responsibilities, with a raise to go along with it. While still processing the news, the team quickly turned to congratulate Anna, knowing she deserved it. Anna, we'll go over the details later today. I'll still be around in an advisory role, maybe even make a sale or two occasionally. But I don't want to take anything away from your numbers. They looked relieved to hear I'd still have a presence, albeit in a limited way. As we left the room, we found Gabriel waiting in the hallway. Why wasn't I included in the meeting? He asked, since he usually attended. Meeting his gaze, I replied calmly, because it was a staff meeting and you're not on staff. He paused, stumbling over his words before finally saying, I noticed the cars are here. I'll get started on them. No need, I said, cutting him off. They've already been checked and prepped for sale. There's nothing left for you to handle. He stared, taken aback. But I always do the inspections on your cars. What's going on, Luke? I sold the business, Gabriel, I replied, struggling to keep my frustration in check. The new owner wants to take it in a different direction. You sold it? He asked, his voice wavering. So, what am I supposed to do now? Of course, he made it about himself. You can collect your paycheck for the last 2 weeks. Anna didn't really need you here, so it's not much, I said. Gabriel had assumed those 23 cars would keep him busy for days. He couldn't have been more mistaken. I felt no pity for him. In fact, I was tempted to call him out as the traitor he was. Later, I met with Anna to go over things. Anna, can we keep this between us? I asked her. Absolutely, Luke, she assured me. You know I'd never say anything. Good. Here's the situation. I began explaining. I set up 2 companies based in Nevada. One owns the property, the other owns the business. I'm the sole shareholder in both. I paused, feeling my anger rise. Soon, I'm going to divorce Stella. I just need to be certain she can't touch the business. Why? Anna asked, her expression puzzled. I've already moved out, I said. Stella doesn't know yet, but I'm not coming back. She was with Gabriel, and honestly, I'm almost convinced Eleanor isn't even mine. She's his. Anna's face hardened as she took it all in. She was one of the few people I trusted, and she'd never let me down. I haven't filed for divorce yet, I continued. I'll keep paying the taxes and utilities on the house to avoid her claiming abandonment and trying to take it all. The way I've structured the sale, by the time the divorce goes through, Stella and Gabriel will have nothing left to fight over. The money will be out of reach by then. For now, I'll only be making a bit from consulting here and there. Anna, I need you to oversee the daily operations, I said. I trust you completely. She agreed, though her jaw tightened as I brought up Stella and Gabriel's betrayal. Oh, and one more thing, I added. Order a new sign and letterhead. We're rebranding the business. That should really convince Stella and Gabriel that the place is no longer under my control. We're calling it Helpless Car. Anna gave me a confused look. One day I'll explain the name, I told her. For now, just know it says everything I need it to. Though puzzled, Anna trusted me and agreed to handle the changes. After a brief chat with the team, I left the office, got into my Audi, and began the drive to Albuquerque. A couple of hours into the trip, my phone lit up. Stella's name appeared on the screen. I hadn't expected her to reach out so soon. This felt familiar. I'd leave, she'd call, we'd talk, and I'd eventually return. Things would seem better, only for us to fall back into the same mess. I answered, curious about her approach this time. Hello? I said, switching to speaker mode. Luke, what's going on? She asked, her tone laced with uncertainty. Nothing. I'm driving to Albuquerque, I replied, keeping my voice even. Why Albuquerque? She probed. Picking up a car? I answered flatly. So, it isn't true then? She asked. I realized what was happening. Gabriel must have filled her in on the situation. She was calling to confirm the details from me directly. I don't know, I dodged, hoping to avoid a direct answer. What have you heard? Gabriel called me, she replied. He said you sold the business. Why would he call you? My question threw her off balance. She hesitated, finally muttering, He's your best friend. Maybe he thought I'd be aware. I almost smirked. Best friend? Is that what you believe? To Gabriel, I was always just the oblivious, out-of-touch guy, the naive Pole who never saw what was really happening around him. I suspected my family felt similarly, perhaps a bit embarrassed that I was just a used car salesman. So yes, I'd sold the business. At least now they wouldn't have that hanging over their heads anymore. Shouldn't we have talked about this first? She asked, a note of anxiety creeping into her voice. I could sense her worry, likely over how it might affect her. But this business was mine, long before we were married, and I had every right to decide its fate. All I wanted was for the new owner to take care of my employees. Did you at least get a good price? She pressed, her concerns now shifting to what the sale meant for her lifestyle. The money wasn't my main concern. I just needed a fresh start. After taking some time off, I'd figure out my next move. And the mortgage? She continued. It's taken care of, I replied. That's one less thing for you to worry about. Only utilities and taxes remain. What about groceries, gas, insurance? Her voice rose, edging toward panic. I couldn't resist a sarcastic retort. Oh, right. Me, the clueless Pole, forgot about all that. Maybe you could consider working more hours. When will you be home? She asked, a tinge of desperation seeping in. I'm not coming back, I replied calmly. What? I told you that night. You said not to return, and I'm honoring your words. She fell silent, then pleaded. You can't do this, Luke. You have to come back. No, I said firmly. I don't. Luke, don't. It's done. Her voice cracked. And Eleanor? What about your daughter? Eleanor? I replied. The same girl ashamed of her last name and of her dad's job selling used cars? She won't have to worry about me now. She's just 13. You can't take her words to heart, she tried, grasping at straws. None of it matters now. You won't have to deal with me again. I hung up and switched off my phone, picturing her shock. She'd start calling soon, but I wanted her to sit with her thoughts. The drive to Albuquerque felt like freedom, and I suspected her next call would be to her lover, filling him in on my departure. Once I arrived, I powered my phone back on .5 missed messages. 3 from Stella, 1 from Gabriel, and 1 from Anna. I called Anna first. Hey, Anna, sorry about that, my phone was off. No problem. Dodging calls you'd rather not take? Yeah, I admitted. Got it. Your wife called me too. Even Gabriel checked in, asking if I'd seen you. I let them know you don't stop by here anymore. Thanks, I said, genuinely grateful for her discretion. If they keep it up, tell them you'll file for harassment. Luke, she said gently, you might feel alone right now, but don't forget, you've got family. Thanks, Anna. You always know exactly what to say, I told her, a bit amused. Your husband's a lucky man. He certainly thinks so, she replied, laughing. After we hung up, I considered calling either Stella or Gabriel, but decided against it. Let them wonder a bit. Instead, I headed down to the parking lot office to meet with the owner. I handed over the keys. Here's the Audi we discussed. Ready to talk trade? He took a long look at the car, visibly impressed. This beauty could sell by next week, no doubt. Are you sure you want to trade it? Feels like I'm getting the better end of the deal. It's not about the money, I said, shrugging. I'm just after a sports car. Half an hour later, I was back on the road, heading north in a convertible bound for Santa Fe. Over the next couple of weeks, I drifted through northern New Mexico, Arizona, Utah, and Colorado, occasionally checking in with Anna in case she needed anything from me. When everything seemed under control, I turned westward. Calls soon started flooding in, angry, apologetic, and then frustrated. I listened, but remained calm. When I heard they'd finally cut off my credit card, I couldn't help but laugh. Gabriel even called to tear into me, calling me all kinds of things for leaving Stella behind. I laughed even harder. My lawyer eventually got in touch to tell me Stella had threatened legal action if I didn't check in with her. I called him right back. She really said that? I asked. Yeah, but don't stress. As long as you're covering the mortgage, she doesn't have a case, he assured me. Well, I have something better than that. I recorded her saying she didn't want me back, I said, feeling reassured. Perfect. Send it over. If she keeps pushing, we'll use it, he replied. The next few months passed in a blur of highways and open skies. I crisscrossed the Southwest. Reno, Lake Tahoe, the coast, Yosemite, San Diego, Las Vegas. Just me and the freedom of the road. The Miata wasn't the most luxurious ride, but it was exhilarating. And once in a while, I noticed people glancing my way. Not that I paid them much mind. Married life was complicated after all. 3 months and 8,000 miles later, I found myself rolling back into Silver City. The dealership crew welcomed me back with open arms, and Anna greeted me with a big smile and a warm hug. We caught up briefly, and I suggested taking the team out for food and drinks. She loved the idea, and even closed the shop early. Later that evening, I met with my lawyer to go over Stella's latest attempt to accuse me of abandoning her. He had already shut it down. We reviewed our next moves, and by 5, I was with the team, unwinding over dinner at Wrangler's. As the night went on, folks gradually started heading out, until it was just Anna and me left. She looked at me with a thoughtful expression. Kerr, you're not helpless. You just put your trust in the wrong people. I smiled, realizing she'd pieced it all together. So you figured it out? It took some time, but yes, those rumors about you, they were completely unfair. You're a lot more than that. Thank you, Anna. You're why I came back. You didn't just step into my role, you made it your own. She grinned. I had a great teacher. We shared one last hug before she left to be with her husband. Returning to my apartment, I was greeted by the stale air of a place left untouched for 3 months. I opened a few windows, grabbed a beer, and sat out on the terrace, my mind drifting back to Stella and how our shared dreams had faded along the way. Around 8:30, I decided to go back to my house. Technically, it was still mine. I'd bought it before our marriage. The yard was overgrown and the house looked neglected. I knocked, and Eleanor opened the door, her face a mix of surprise and hesitation. Dad, she said, barely above a whisper. Is your mom here? She called for Stella, who came out from the kitchen, her expression shifting from shock to anger. What are you doing here? She demanded. Just passing through, I replied, keeping my voice steady. That's when Gabriel walked out from the bedroom wearing nothing but his underwear. Well, looks like everyone's here, I said with a wry smile. Stella's face showed nothing but confusion, while Eleanor fidgeted nervously. Gabriel moved in because we needed the help after you left, she said sharply, resentment dripping from each word. You've got it wrong, I replied immediately. Gabriel never worked for me, so I had no reason to fire him. And as for the bills, they're all paid up. But what about basics like food and gas? We're barely scraping by, Luke, Stella cut in, her voice rising. You had a job, wasn't that supposed to cover groceries? Now you think you can just come waltzing back here? I'm not here to stay, I said firmly. You, Gabriel, and Eleanor have until the end of next month to find somewhere else to live. Angry, Stella shot back. She's our daughter, Luke. I laughed bitterly. Actually, Eleanor isn't mine. She's Gabriel's. Silence blanketed the room. Eleanor's face registered shock, while Stella went pale. Gabriel just stood there, speechless. I handed them a copy of the DNA report. See for yourselves. They both read it, sinking into their chairs in stunned silence. Turning to Eleanor, I added, let them know they'll get the divorce papers and an eviction notice next week. I'm done here. I didn't wait for a reaction. As I left, a bitter thought lingered. Had the affair always been there? Had Stella ever truly been loyal? Probably not. I met her when she came to buy a car, and Gabriel was the one fixing it. I thought it was fate then, Now, it felt like she'd chosen him before I even entered her life. Back in my apartment, I cracked open a beer, trying to clear my mind. The next morning, I went to my lawyer, set up the divorce, and started the process to sell the house. The house would need to go on the market, and whatever it made, we'd split. With my unstable job situation, I wouldn't owe alimony or child support, especially given Gabriel's involvement. The betrayal stung deeply, and I doubted I'd trust anyone, man or woman, for a long time. Therapy could help, but for now, I threw myself back into my job at the dealership. No longer in charge, I took a position as a salesman, aiming for one sale a week just to cover rent and food. That would be enough. When it came to the court-mandated child support, I committed to paying only the bare minimum. As the divorce proceedings advanced, Stella hired an attorney. I wasn't sure how she afforded it. Maybe it was a pro bono deal. But they didn't delve too far into my finances. My lawyer had ensured my assets were protected. Meanwhile, I discovered that Gabriel had practically camped out at the dealership while I was away, constantly trying to convince Anna to hire him. She rejected him flatly each time. Eventually, he gave up and ended up with a low-paying job at Valvoline, doing oil changes. Once I notified Stella that the house was on the market, I reached out to a realtor. She had already received the eviction notice, which meant she'd need to vacate before it sold. One evening, I heard a knock at my apartment door. When I opened it, there was Stella. "What do you want, Stella?" I asked, keeping my voice cold. "Can we talk?" she asked, sounding softer than I remembered. "I don't think that's a good idea," I said. "We're in the middle of a lawsuit. Please, Luke, it's just me. No lawyers involved. Can we just talk civilly?" she pleaded, a rare vulnerability in her eyes. I hesitated, then agreed. "Fine, but let's go to Denny's. I'd rather be somewhere public." I didn't trust her enough to meet in private. We found a booth at Denny's, and after some awkward small talk, I finally asked, "Why, Stella?" She looked away, then met my eyes. "The truth?" she whispered. "I cared about both of you, and I couldn't make a choice." "Seeing both of us at the same time?" I asked, struggling to keep my voice steady. She looked down, her face clouded with shame. "Yes," she admitted in a near whisper. "Gabriel insisted it stay a secret. He thought it would ruin everything if you knew." "He was worried about our work, wasn't he?" I continued, my voice edged with frustration. "But when I asked you to marry me, why did you agree?" Her gaze lifted, and I saw her eyes glistening with tears. "Because I loved you," she murmured, barely loud enough to hear. "And what about Gabriel?" I pressed. "I loved him too," she confessed, her words shaky. "But I knew he could never be the husband I wanted. So when you proposed, we decided it was over. I wanted to give my whole self to you, to our marriage. Yet on our wedding day, you told him, 'I'm marrying Luke, but you're still my man,' and had one last moment together?" I asked, my anger simmering just below the surface. Stella broke down, tears streaming as she said, "It all felt so wrong. Everything felt wrong." "Tell me, Stella, what exactly felt wrong?" I struggled to maintain my composure, waiting for her response. I didn't want to lose him, and he didn't want to lose me. I didn't know how to let him go," she stammered. I shook my head bitterly. "Well, congratulations," I said, sarcasm lacing my words. "Now he's all yours. You even have a child together. Nice choice on the name Kari, by the way." Stella's face fell, a look of horror dawning. I didn't realize," she stammered, visibly shaken. "I didn't know that Smith wasn't yours." I took a deep breath, fighting to stay calm. After those 3 months away, I had pieced together enough of the truth. "So, Stella," I said, looking at her squarely, "why are you here? What is it you want from me?" She wiped her tears, her expression softening. "I wanted to tell you that I still love you, Luke." I sighed, leaning back. "That's touching, Stella. But I don't think you really understand what love is." "I did love you," she whispered, tears falling freely. "I made so many mistakes, but I loved you." "I believe you," I replied. "I believe you cared for me, but not in the way I loved you. And now, I don't feel the same. I did once, but now all I feel is contempt." The look on her face told me she understood this was the end. "There's no going back, Stella," I said, my voice resolute. Then, after a pause, I asked, "Did you and Gabriel ever really stop seeing each other?" I already knew the answer but needed her to confirm it. She bit her lip, hesitated, and finally shook her head. "No, we tried, but we kept meeting, usually twice a month." Hearing it stung, but I felt a strange sense of freedom. Finally, she was telling the truth. "One last thing," I said, holding her gaze. "About a year ago, everything changed. You became so cold. Why?" Her cheeks flushed with guilt, and after a pause, she said, "Gabriel started pressuring me into things I didn't want. He wanted something more, unconventional, but not with you. The way he pushed me twisted everything. I started to resent you even though it wasn't your fault. It sounds warped, but I hated you for not being the kind of man who'd go along with that." The words hung heavy in the air, almost too surreal to process. "Did you really go through with it?" I asked, though I already knew the truth wouldn't change no matter what she said. She lowered her gaze, shaking her head. "I considered it," she murmured, barely meeting my eyes. "But in the end, I couldn't go through with it." I took a breath, standing up slowly. "And then you left, and everything fell apart," I replied, the words feeling more final than I'd expected. "You're free now, Stella. Do whatever you want. It doesn't matter to me." I laid some cash on the table for the bill, making it clear that this was the end. "This is it. We're finished." The weight of those words settled between us, silent and irreversible. Without another word, we made our way out to the parking lot, walking side by side but miles apart. We knew we'd reached the end of whatever story we'd shared. 4 months later, we stood in court, facing a judge who would put an official end to everything. Gabriel waited for her outside, lingering close by. As I left the courthouse, Gabriel caught up to me. "Luke," he started, his tone unsure. "Maybe we could grab a drink sometime, talk things over like in the old days." I glanced at him, surprised he'd even suggest it. But whatever bitterness I'd felt toward him, or toward Stella, was gone. They were strangers now, just people I used to know. I shrugged. "Sure, why not?" We went for a drink, and as I looked around the room, it hit me. This was probably the last time I'd be in their world. They could be together now. Whatever they made of it was their concern, not mine. Leaving the bar, I thought about how different Stella's life would be now, far from the comfort she'd grown used to. She and Gabriel would have their own battles, their own hurdles to cross. But that was no longer my burden. I was finally free. I might be a lot of things, a Polish man, a used car salesman, but above all, I had my pride. From here on, I'd live life my way, on my terms. My friend, and this is the end of the story. If you liked this story, then put your royal like and subscribe to the channel. May the force be with you.